So while I was writing my reviews for Dragon Ball Daima and Sparking Zero, I realized that these two things have something surprising in common. It's not the fact that they both came out around the same time and are both very well received, but rather they both display in very different ways how the original Dragon Ball is treated and often mistreated by the people who run the show and the very community itself. This is something I've thought for a very long time, and I know I'm not the only Dragon Ball fan who thinks this. Despite making up over 190 out of 519 total manga chapters, the original Dragon Ball often gets ignored, mistreated, or at worst is shown utter contempt. I know it may seem strange to say this when there is a show currently airing right now that is very blatantly harkening back to the style and tone of the original Dragon Ball. Plus, I'm also not suggesting that the people making this show don't respect the original material. It's just that oftentimes whenever they try to pay tribute to the original Dragon Ball, it ends up feeling like a hollow gesture. Nostalgia pandering for the original manga is nothing new for this franchise, but the way the material before Dragon Ball Z is often treated is unlike anything I've ever seen from a shonen franchise, let alone one as popular as Dragon Ball. I was originally going to put all of this in my review for Dragon Ball Daima, but this ended up becoming so long that I decided it had to become its own video. So what exactly did I mean when I said the original Dragon Ball is often mistreated? I mean, I'm obviously not suggesting that Toei, Shueisha, or even Akira Toriyama himself hate everything that came before Z, and I would especially never suggest that the fans do either. Well, at least most of them don't. Not to mention that now we have two Dragon Ball shows that involve Goku getting turned into a kid and going on a mystical adventure to find the Dragon Balls as a way of bringing the show back to those simpler times before Z, back when the tone was a lot sillier, when Saiyans didn't hog the spotlight, and before Goku had 12 different transformations. And since people are so nostalgic for that time now, it's no wonder they keep harkening back to it. Though in GT's case, that ended up working out so poorly that they had to make the show more like Dragon Ball Z to bring in viewers again. But in Daima's case, they're leaning even harder by making it so Goku can't use Ki and he uses the Power Pull again. Plus in the dub, they even brought back Kid Goku's original voice actress. But I find it strange how often this franchise seems to want to go back to the good old days and not move past the end of Z. I mean, they tried it once with GT, but that was over 20 years ago. And since that show ended, during the time period where there was a large drought of Dragon Ball content, we got both an OVA and a movie that take place after the defeat of Kid Buu, but before the end of Z. And since then, we've been getting Dragon Ball Super content for almost a decade, and we still haven't moved past this time period. Considering when the superhero movie takes place, and now the Black Frieza arc might be the final arc in the Super manga, it's only a matter of time before they can no longer remain in this post-Buu, pre-Oob time period. I guess Toriyama just considers the end of Z the end, so he doesn't want to push past that time period. And GT doesn't count because he wasn't really involved with that. Though now that Toriyama is no longer with us, who knows what they'll end up doing the next time they make another Dragon Ball story. But even if they don't want to intersect with the GT timeline, there's still many stories they could tell in that 5-year gap between the end of Z and the beginning of GT. We want to actually see Goku training Oob, we want to see Goten, Trunks, and Pan growing up, and we want to see Goku continue to get stronger. I mean, we've been consistently getting new Dragon Ball stories ever since Battle of Gods came out over a decade ago, so they've proven that they can at least make new stories with new characters and interesting villains that fans actually like, though Akira Toriyama seemed content with ending the story with the last chapter of the manga. And it wasn't until almost 2 decades later when Battle of Gods was being made that he got motivated to work on the franchise again. That's also because since the ending of Dragon Ball was so open-ended, it just left fans wanting more. But it's also like that on purpose, since they don't want to reach a point in the timeline where Goku gets too old to fight, or he gets so powerful that no one else could match him. It's not like One Piece, which has a definitive goal at the end of the story. They just want Goku to keep getting stronger and fighting stronger enemies until the end of time. And even though Saiyans stay young for a long time, Goku's a grandfather now, so he can't stay young forever. Though of course Dragon Ball GT did give the story a more definitive ending, but GT's status as canon is very dubious at best. But unless they make some final Dragon Ball Super story where Goku loses his god powers and Ultra Instinct, then for now GT is not canon. Though the last Dragon Ball movie didn't really have Goku in it much at all, so maybe they're willing to try the possibility of having more stories not focused on him. But if you're wondering why I'm even bringing up all this, is because their refusal to move the story past the end of Z is part of the reason why I believe they keep going back to the original Dragon Ball. I mean, when the Dragon Ball Z anime ended, they decided the next story should be one where Goku gets turned into a kid and has to find the Dragon Balls again, just like in the original Dragon Ball. And now that's happened again. With the end of the Dragon Ball Super anime, we got a new show where Goku is a kid and has to find the Dragon Balls. Part of what makes Dragon Ball so special is that we get to see Goku start out as this little naive monkey boy who grows into the powerful Saiyan warrior, husband, father, and grandfather that he is today. But one of my main problems with the whole Dragon Ball situation is that there's a large number of people who have never even seen that growth. For a large number of Dragon Ball fans, Goku started out as a father and a Saiyan from the beginning. Of course, I can't speak for all Dragon Ball fans, but at least here in America, the overwhelming majority of fans started at Z and never went back to watch the original Dragon Ball. Hell, a lot of them don't even know that there was a show before Dragon Ball Z, and even the ones that are aware of its existence think it's a prequel that came out after Z. And that's mostly because in America, the dub of Dragon Ball came out after Z, and when it aired on TV, the ratings were so bad they never even aired the entire show. And to my knowledge, the entirety of Dragon Ball has never aired on American TV before, but Dragon Ball Z has aired in its entirety on multiple different channels throughout the years. Though a large part of why the original Dragon Ball didn't do too well on American TV is because of the fact that it aired after Dragon Ball Z. At the time, most Dragon Ball Z fans didn't want to see Goku go from a Super Saiyan 3 fighting against a planet-busting god killer to a goofy little boy going on a lighthearted adventure. But nowadays, the main thing preventing people from actually going back and watching the show is because they think it's too old for them. With so many new shows and anime coming out, a lot of people don't want to go back and watch an outdated shonen from the 80s. Of course, this feeling that the original show is outdated isn't helped by the fact that the audio and visual quality of most episodes isn't great, on top of the fact that the way Dragon Ball is treated compared to the rest of the franchise makes it feel like it's not as important. To most fans, it just feels like an optional watch, but that couldn't be further from the truth. If you don't watch Dragon Ball, you're not just missing out on a good story, but you're also missing so much essential context, lore, character introductions, development, world building, and story arcs, and of course without it, there would be no Dragon Ball Z. I'm not just making this video because I'm salty people aren't watching a show that I like, especially since I know the original series isn't perfect by any means, but it's more so because this is a phenomenon that I've only seen with Dragon Ball, at least when it comes to shonen anime. Like, I know most Naruto fans don't skip the first show and go straight to Shippuden, and if they did, Naruto fans would just bully them into watching the original show. Like, imagine skipping the first 5 or 6 seasons of a show, imagine skipping the first 2 parts of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and imagine if people never saw how Luffy met Zoro, Nami, Usopp, and Sanji because they just skipped to when they get to the Grand Line. Well, that's how the Dragon Ball fandom is, because there's a very large amount of them that have never seen Goku meeting Bulma, Krillin, Muten Roshi, or Tenshinhan. They don't know how Piccolo went from being Goku's mortal enemy to his strongest rival. They don't know how Goku discovered the Dragon Balls for the first time, how he did a Kamehameha for the first time, how he reunited with his grandfather, how he won his first tournament, and they don't even know that Yamcha actually used to be cool. Which reminds me, there's a lot of memes about how a lot of the OG Dragon Ball cast, especially Yamcha, are really weak and lame. And I think that's simply because most of these fans haven't seen these characters' introductions or how they grew over the course of the show. I mean, there was a time when Roshi was stronger than Goku, or when Krillin was Goku's rival, and when Tien was a cold-blooded killer. But one of the characters who gets it the worst is Chi-Chi, though the English dub and anime filler certainly didn't help her either. It's not like I'm any better though. I remember the first time I decided to finally sit down and fully watch the show. I started with Dragon Ball Z. I watched up until Goku gets killed by Piccolo in their fight with Raditz, and I remember being confused as to who Kami was, who Fortune Teller Baba was, and before they talked about all this history with Goku and Piccolo that I didn't know about. It felt like I was missing a lot of context, and then I realized it was because there's a whole other show that I didn't watch that came before it. So I watched the entirety of Dragon Ball and then Dragon Ball Z in the proper order, and when I did, it made me appreciate Dragon Ball Z even more. Not only that, but I fell in love with the original Dragon Ball, and there's many parts of it that I find are much better than Dragon Ball Z. I mean, one of my favorite characters in the series is Tenshinhan, and I wouldn't really care much about him if I only watched Dragon Ball Z. Plus, at the time, I watched both shows dubbed, and unlike Dragon Ball Z, Dragon Ball's dub was way more faithful to the original script, and the music was unchanged, not to mention the aspect ratio was unchanged the way God intended. I often see many people claim that Goku is a stagnant character who doesn't develop throughout the series, and they'll even go as far to say that he's a bad protagonist because of this. I think people feel this way because if you've only seen Dragon Ball Z, you're starting the show in the late stages of his character arc. Dragon Ball Z starts with Goku learning about his Saiyan heritage, and by the Namek arc, he learns to accept it and embrace it, which is less than halfway into the show. But it's not like he stops developing there either, because by the end of the Cell games, he learns to take responsibility for his actions. Goku's not the type of character like Vegeta who goes through a major change in the story. Goku's character development is pretty flat, meaning he's pretty much the same character throughout the whole series, but that doesn't mean he has no development at all. If you watched or read the original Dragon Ball all the way back in Chapter 1, comparing him to the Goku at the end of the Buu saga, you'll see that he's a very different character. But of course, this isn't a video about how people mischaracterize Goku, because that could be an entire video on its own. But it also ties back to what I said about the series' refusal to move past the end of Z. And since we're constantly stuck in this post-Buu arc era, a lot of characters have become stagnant and go through the same arcs over and over, and in some cases they even regress. A lot of people used to criticize Dragon Ball Super for making Goku a lot dumber than he normally is, and now in Dragon Ball Daima it's only gotten worse. because despite the fact that the wish to turn them into children doesn't explicitly make them act like children, Goku's still acting like a little child in this show. And I don't think it's because they forgot how to write Goku or anything, it's probably just because they want him to act like how he did when he was a little kid in Dragon Ball. When it comes to media beyond just anime and manga, it's even more clear that Z gets more love than Dragon Ball. There are way more Dragon Ball Z games, toys, and films. I mean, it's not like I don't know why this is the case, it's because Z is the clear moneymaker, but that's one of the reasons why I loved Budokai Tenkaichi 3 so much, because I got to play as so many Dragon Ball characters that would rarely show up in other games. But even though Dragon Ball characters rarely showed up in Dragon Ball Z games, at least Dragon Ball got its own games sometimes, though in America, our options were pretty limited. But nowadays, we don't get any Dragon Ball games at all. I always thought Dragon Ball would make a really good JRPG, or maybe an open-world action RPG, but when we finally did get a Dragon Ball RPG, it was all Z stuff, save for one really short DLC that only focuses on the last arc of Dragon Ball. Though I was still happy when Kakarot released that DLC, since it's the most Dragon Ball content we've gotten in a Dragon Ball game in over 15 years. Even games like Xenoverse 1 and 2 that are meant to take place throughout various time periods in the franchise's history only really does Z, Super, and a bit of GT. I mean, Xenoverse 2 still gets DLC to this day, and we still don't even have Master Roshi as a playable character. Imagine if Sonic Generations just skipped Sonic 1, 2, and 3 entirely. Though I guess there's Dragon Ball The Breakers, which lets you play as some of the non-fighters in Dragon Ball, like Oolong, Puar, and Young Bulma, but they don't even have King Piccolo as a raider in that game, which I find strange. But then, when Dragon Ball Sparking Zero was announced, I grew hopeful once again, since the Tenkaichi series was known for having characters from the original series in its roster. I figured at the very least we'd be getting Tao Pai Pai or King Piccolo, maybe even Arale. But when the game did come out, although I did enjoy it a lot, I was very disappointed to find out that not only was Kid Goku, or I guess here, Goku Teen, was the only OG Dragon Ball character in the entire game, but they also use his design from the Broly movie, where he shows up for like 5 frames. He doesn't even get any alternate outfits either. I mean, I don't think this design is bad or anything, but Goku never wears a black undershirt in the entire series. But it's not his inaccurate design that bothers me, it's that in a series that's all about having a huge roster full of iconic characters from the entire series' long history, they couldn't be bothered to include any other character from the beginning of the series besides the main character. I mean, Tien, Yamcha, and Roshi get alternate outfits from the original series, which is nice at least. We couldn't even get King Piccolo, or even Great Ape Goku. I mean, if King Piccolo was the only other Dragon Ball character in the game, and they also had the stage where him and Goku fight, I would be pretty satisfied. At least then, Kid Goku would have someone and somewhere to fight. I mean, I know Dragon Ball Super didn't exist when they were making Tenkaichi 3, so now with this new game they have to fill in even more slots with new characters and forms than ever before. But I would have been completely okay if they didn't have some of the movie villains and instead had more Dragon Ball characters. I mean, imagine any other shonen franchise not including a character like King Piccolo or Tao Pai Pai, and instead having Garlic Jr. and Dr. Wheelo. I know characters like Broly, Cooler, and Janemba are immensely popular, but it's strange that the series seems to have so much more reverence for the Dragon Ball Z non-canon movies than it does for the first 190 chapters of the manga. Like, imagine if a One Piece game included El Dorado and Dr. Ratchet as playable characters instead of someone like Arlong or NL. Hell, for most other shonen anime, it is extremely rare to get non-canon or movie characters in the video games. Yet with most Dragon Ball Z games, it's almost a necessity. I know most people are used to it by now, but it's still extremely strange that characters like Turles and Bojack are way more common as playable characters in Dragon Ball video games than Kid Goku. Well, if Kakarot can get Dragon Ball DLC, then maybe Sparking Zero will too. But I think everyone would have been completely okay if the movie characters were DLC and the original Dragon characters were in the base game instead. I mean, since Akira Toriyama did just recently pass away, it would be nice to at least have Arale as a playable character. I mean, she's even in Dragon Ball Super. But I guess when it comes to Kid Goku, they don't want to add him because they're afraid of there being too many Gokus in the game. So we just have to hope that if Kid Goku from GT is in the game, that they at least give him some references to the original Dragon Ball. Like how in Dragon Ball FighterZ he uses the Power Pole, even though in GT he never uses that at all. And speaking of which, it always annoys me when they use the Power Pole and Nimbus to be like, hey guys, remember Dragon Ball? But Goku never even uses them. Well, at least in Daima he actually uses the Power Pole, but in the opening he's riding the Nimbus, and he doesn't use the Nimbus once in the show. Though of course, video games aren't everything, and it's clear from what I've been saying that Dragon Ball isn't completely forgotten about, but that's not really the issue. Usually whenever Dragon Ball does get acknowledged is when they nostalgia pander to that era, but Dragon Ball Z is still the favorite child, and it does get pandered to a lot more than Dragon Ball does, but Super and GT both also pandered to the original Dragon Ball a lot. But ironically, it's Dragon Ball Super that panders to the original Dragon Ball a lot more than Dragon Ball GT. I mean, I know the word pandering has a negative connotation, but in Super it wasn't all bad. And I'm not just talking about that scene with Goku and the Nimbus, or him recreating his fight with Grandpa Gohan. And another way they keep reminding you about the original Dragon Ball is by constantly having Master Roshi come back to fight. Even though he said he was retiring so that he can let the new generation take over, well, we can ask Krillin and Yamcha how that's going. Although I will say I was very happy when they included the Pilaf gang in Dragon Ball Z Battle of Gods. It was the first time we've seen these characters since Dragon Ball GT, and I was very happy that they got a major part in this new Dragon Ball movie. And although I do like these characters and their recent inclusion in modern Dragon Ball media was a nice tribute to the original Dragon Ball, I'd say they're very much overstating their welcome for a long time. For the most part, all they do is pretty much hang around Capsule Corp, not really contributing much, besides Mai, but I don't even want to get started on her. But one of the most iconic things about Dragon Ball that was absent throughout most of Z were the tournament arcs. And since we never really got a true tournament in Dragon Ball Z, Dragon Ball Super brought it back with the Universe 6 tournament. But most of all, Dragon Ball Super also brought back the more lighthearted tone that the original Dragon Ball is known for. But the thing is, a lot of Dragon Ball fans don't want it to be more lighthearted. They want it to be serious and epic. It's why the Goku Black and Tournament of Power arcs are the most popular ones in Super. Whenever Dragon Ball Super goes for a more comedic approach, it often gets heavily criticized by the fans. Like in the Arale episode, a lot of people did not like how gag-oriented it was, though that's a more extreme example. But even going as far back as when Battle of Gods first came out, I remember a lot of people criticize how unserious Beerus was throughout most of the movie. Even nowadays, when Dragon Ball Daima was first revealed at New York Comic Con, it got a large amount of backlash from the fans, though most of that was due to most fans just wanting more Dragon Ball Super. But speaking of Daima, that brings me to why I made this video in the first place, and it's sort of the pinnacle of all the problems I've mentioned thus far. You'd think I'd be ecstatic that there's a new Dragon Ball show that harkens back to the original this much. I mean, Goku's a kid again, he can't fly, he can't use ki, he's going on a journey to collect the Dragon Balls, and they're even giving a minor character like Shin more spotlight, although at first I was a bit dubious about how his chemistry would work with Goku. But so far I'm really enjoying this show. The new environment is cool, the new characters are interesting, and the animation is beautiful. But most of the things I'm enjoying about this show are in spite of the fact that they're pandering a lot to the original Dragon Ball. Because even though I'm really enjoying the larger focus on more hand-to-hand combat, and Goku using the Power Pole for the first time in years, I still really don't like the decision to turn everybody into children. Because even though they did that to remind you of the days when Goku was a kid, they still have Vegeta and Piccolo as major players in this show, and Goku can still fly and go Super Saiyan. And although now finding the Dragon Balls feels like a difficult journey rather than a trivial fetch quest, here they only need to collect 3 Dragon Balls, so they don't have that constant state of progression like the original show had, where they found a new ball almost every new location they went to. I mean, even Dragon Ball GT understood this. 6 episodes in, they haven't found a single Dragon Ball yet, and although the lighthearted tone is still intact, the show does take itself very seriously and it lore dumps quite a bit. And it would have been nice if other minor characters got more of a chance to shine in this show like Shin does, rather than Vegeta and Piccolo. I mean, I'm not saying they need to make Krillin or Ten Shinhan major characters again, but even Gohan isn't in this show at all. So it doesn't really feel like this show is bringing us back to the good old days. It just feels like a more child-friendly Dragon Ball Z. I guess now this is sort of turning into an early review of Dragon Ball Daima, but this doesn't really reflect how I feel about the show itself, more so it reflects my problem with the franchise as a whole. Lately, we've been getting more Dragon Ball content than ever, but the series doesn't want to move forward, instead it keeps going back. But we want to see Goten and Trunks actually grow up. We want to actually see Goku and Oob train together. We want to see Goku keep getting stronger, not weaker. I mean, it's cool in Daima that we're seeing more of the Demon Realm, which is a place I've always wanted to see in Dragon Ball, but as of right now, we don't even know if Dragon Ball Daima is considered canon. I mean, not that that really matters in the grand scheme of things, but still, I guess it doesn't matter that the characters are all kids again, since like I said, I'm still really enjoying Daima, but my feelings are a bit more complicated than that. I also have a theory that the reason why they did this is because they're afraid that if they keep moving the series forward, then it might jump the shark more than it already has. What I mean by that is that now we have so many different Super Saiyan forms, God forms, different colored hair, and even Orange Piccolo. We've reached a point now where there's so many different forms that it's getting ridiculous, and almost every time we get a new villain or a new arc, they have to introduce a new form for them to power up to beat that villain. Even though Dragon Ball Super is the biggest culprit of this, I also think they struck a good balance when Super Saiyan Blue was introduced. For a majority of that show, Super Saiyan Blue was the pinnacle Super Saiyan form, and the only way they could get stronger wasn't by finding a Super Saiyan Blue 2 or something, but rather Vegeta found a stronger form of Super Saiyan Blue, and Goku used Kaioken on top of it. And when they introduced Ultra Instinct, I thought it was a really cool idea, because it wasn't a form that was unique to Saiyans, it's something anyone can achieve, and once Goku masters it, he can do it without even needing to power up at all. But the problem is, they keep treating Ultra Instinct like it's a transformation rather than the technique that it is. And considering the state of Dragon Ball now, who knows if we'll ever even see Goku actually master Ultra Instinct in the anime. But when it comes to forms I don't like, the 2 biggest offenders of this are Beast Gohan and Orange Piccolo, both introduced in the same movie. And I don't want to get into a whole review on that movie, One of the things I really liked about it was how small scale it was, at least at first, and I definitely don't think it was necessary to give Gohan and Piccolo these ultra-powerful forms that rival God forms in order to stop the Red Ribbon Army. But I did like how much it focused on Piccolo, and I'm hoping we get more stories that focus on other characters too. Plus, in Dragon Ball Super Broly, we got a whole section of that movie that was dedicated to seeing Planet Vegeta during a time we don't get to see often. If they want to make more stories like that, maybe we can get one about Master Roshi's past, or maybe we can get one about Tien and Chaozu training with the Crane School, or maybe we can even get more manga, like that time I got reincarnated as Yamcha, or the Jocko spinoff. But if they really wanted to go this route with Dragon Ball Daima by bringing the series back to the basics, then this could have been the perfect opportunity to make a show for people who have never even seen Dragon Ball before, or Dragon Ball Z for that matter. I mean, sure, a new fan probably could jump in by watching Daima, but it's not really a good idea since it requires so much knowledge of the series prior in order to understand what's going on. But my biggest issue is that their constant nostalgia pandering to the original Dragon Ball is starting to feel a little hollow to me. And I'm not just talking about the lack of Dragon Ball representation in video games, but in America we still can't buy Dragon Ball on Blu-ray yet, and there's been like 3 different releases of Dragon Ball Z on Blu-ray. I mean, at least the Dragon Ball DVDs aren't as bad as the Dragon Ball Z DVDs, but still, we've been using the same box set for the past 15 years, and we haven't even gotten a new one for the show's anniversary. It often feels like even a show like Dragon Ball GT gets way more love than Dragon Ball does. I know I'm not the only person that feels this way about Dragon Ball, but a lot of the fans have also been saying recently that it should get a remake. Now, when it comes to whether or not Dragon Ball should get a remake, I'm a bit conflicted. Because on the one hand, if it does get one, it will reaffirm those beliefs that the original series is outdated, which I don't think is true at all. Because not only does a lot of the animation in the original show still hold up to this day, but a remake just wouldn't have that same voice cast or music that makes it so special. But on the other hand, it would bring a ton of new fans into the series, plus people that have been fans for years will fondly watch the original Dragon Ball for the first time, hopefully with some really good animation too. I mean, anime remakes are nothing new, but it seems that lately they're all the rage. We got one for Rurouni Kenshin, Shaman King, and Dragon Quest, just to name a few. But what really sparked this debate is when it was announced that One Piece was getting a remake. Of all the anime remakes, One Piece is one of those shows that I feel like deserves one the least. But pretty much the main reason it's being made is because One Piece has gotten so long, they're hoping that a modern series with faster pacing will bring more fans into the franchise. And that's coming from the biggest anime in the world, so if One Piece can get one, why not Dragon Ball? And normally I would say that at least if the remake sucks, the original will always be there for us to watch. But when it comes to watching the original Dragon Ball, and especially Dragon Ball Z, watching the original isn't as simple as it may seem. I mean, maybe instead of a remake, they can just give it the Kai treatment. I mean, in Japan, Dragon Ball Z Kai is just called Dragon Ball Kai, but Dragon Ball never got a Kai of its own. Although to be fair, Kai almost didn't even finish the entire run of Dragon Ball Z. But lately in the recent Dragon Ball Super movies, and in Daima, we've been getting some reanimated scenes from the original Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z, which make people want a remake even more. But at the very least, I think making a Dragon Ball remake would be way more successful at harkening back to those original times, rather than what Daima's doing right now. Because watching a remake would be the closest I'll ever feel to watching Dragon Ball again, but Dragon Ball Daima is more like Dragon Ball Z with a little bit of a Dragon Ball coat of paint. Because if anything, those recent reanimated scenes we've been getting have shown that they can really nail that old Dragon Ball art style perfectly. Because that's another thing about Daima that doesn't really make it feel like Dragon Ball. If you're gonna make Goku a little kid, at least make him look a bit chubby. But if Dragon Ball did get a remake, I would hope that they would do Z as well. Because in the manga, there is no Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z. It's not split into 2 parts, it's just Dragon Ball. And that pretty much sums up my feelings about the original Dragon Ball. Because regardless of whether someone likes it or doesn't, they shouldn't view it as a separate show. Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z are a single entity. One cannot exist without the other. So if anything, all I ask is that people stop treating Dragon Ball separately, and start treating it and Dragon Ball Z as one continuous story, the way Akira Toriyama intended.